Hello, I'm Sachi Inari Rizzo, curator of prints and drawings here at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Every other month, I present a talk in the Print and Drawing Study Center and offer it virtually. In last season's Print Room Talks, we went back to the basics of printmaking and explored various printmaking processes. You may have noticed that contemporary prints can be large in scale, complex in color and composition, and at times even three-dimensional. It begs the question, are the artists making these prints on their own? We envision artists working alone in their studios, the creative genius. However, mediums like glass, sculpture, and printmaking can be more collaborative. For this year, we will be looking at the development of the post-World War II print renaissance in the US, seen in the proliferation of printmaking workshops, their interconnections, and the artists who together are making some of the most exciting prints that we see today. Artists with or without an in-depth background in printmaking can work at professional print workshops where their ideas can be explored, tapping the knowledge of experienced master printers. Artists may arrive in the studio with drawings or may have no preconceived notion before working on a matrix. The printer helps with the preparation of blocks and plates, the selection of inks and paper, and is a problem solver. After many trial proofs run as tests, the artist will give approval by signing what's called the right to print proof. The printer will use this as the guide to make uniform impressions of the edition. While the technical skills and solutions offered by master printers in printmaking workshops may be key in the realization of the final print, their position is seldom celebrated. Let's take a moment to talk about the various roles in the world of print publishing. A print studio may be contracted by dealers, independent publishers, or artists to provide the printing services. The publisher is the one selecting and inviting the artist to do the project, financing it, and distributing the prints. However, the print studio can take on the responsibility of both printer and publisher, which gives them a greater part in the creative decisions, the marketing, and sales. So today we will look at some of the early pioneering print workshops that helped pave the way for the wide and rich print field that we see today. In 1940, British artist Stanley William Hayter relocated his printmaking workshop, Atelier 17, to New York. This past spring, we had an exhibition on this topic, as seen here. Atelier 17 was a new resource for artists, providing printmaking facilities, technical expertise, and an environment ripe for experimentation. Hayter's focus was on the promotion of engraving and other intaglio, that is, copper plate print processes. Not only did artists hone their skills, but members of Atelier 17 went on to teach printmaking and add facilities at universities, disseminating ideas and methods to the next generation. Atelier 17 was an important precedent for the next wave of printmaking workshops to open in the 1950s to the present. Its legacy was less about how many of their techniques were carried forward, but more about approaching the medium through experimentation and working in a group atmosphere. Key to the print renaissance was the revitalization of interest in lithography, changing the attitudes towards the medium and the collaborative approach. Lithography had fallen out of favor with fine artists, partly because of its association with commercial industry, but also the lack of professional printers who had the technical knowledge and the desire to work with artists. We look to Pratt Graphics Center, Universal Limited Art Editions, and Tamarin Lithography Workshop as the pioneers of this print revival for their reinvigoration of lithography. These three very different printmaking workshops were the brainchild of three women, Margaret Lowengrund, Tatiana Grossman, and June Wayne. We need to begin with Margaret Lowengrund, who was the first woman to open a printmaking workshop in the US. She was the subject of an exhibition this past summer at the Print Center, New York, called A Model Workshop, Margaret Lowengrund and the Contemporaries. Margaret Lowengrund was an artist, printer, and taught lithography at the New School of Social Research. In 1951, she opened the Contemporaries on Madison Avenue in New York. It was part print workshop and art gallery, featuring largely graphic works by artists from around the world. In 1955, she moved the gallery a few doors down, and the workshop moved to a larger space on 3rd Avenue. Unlike Atelier 17, Lowengrund's print workshop explored the use of lithography, woodcut, and screen print just as much as intaglio. To help with her finances, she partnered with fine arts school Pratt Institute the following year. As a nonprofit institution, she was able to secure a $50,000 grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and the workshop was renamed Pratt Contemporaries Graphic Arts Center, and later Pratt Graphic Arts Center after Lohengrin passed away. The Fort Wayne Museum of Art does not have an example of work from Pratt Graphic Arts Center, but I'm sharing a related publication project of theirs. It was a journal on printmaking called Artist Proof. This is from the museum's library's collection. The first issue came out in 1961. On the book jacket, it described Pratt Graphic Arts Center. It reads, "It quickly became a way station for artists from all around the world. The workshop was open 11 months of the year, 5 days a week, from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Artists, students, and art teachers experimented, exchanged experiences, studied and printed editions of etchings, lithographs, and graphics and other media." So essentially, its intent was to be a printmaking facility and resource for professional artists who wanted to make prints, and as well as a training center for students to learn lithography. Universal Limited Art Editions, referred to as ULAE, is the second print press we will look at. Its printmaking origins go back to Tatiana Grossman's husband, Maurice, who was an artist who had put together a modest income living in New York by teaching, doing commercial work, and framing. In the early 1950s, he learned screen printing on his own with the intent of printing high-quality reproductions of famous works of art. Tatiana would take portfolios of the prints out to sell. In spring 1955, Maurice had a heart attack. Unable to climb the 4 flights of stairs to their New York apartment, the Grossmans left the city and moved to the summer cottage in West Islip, Long Island. Tatiana was faced with finding a way to support them financially. They continued their business. Maurice managed to do the printing, and Tatiana did all the selling, accounting, and building of their clientele. By 1956, their company gained the name Universal Limited Art Editions. Their friend, William S. Lieberman, who was curator of prints and illustrated books at the Museum of Modern Art, advised that there were other firms who could print nice reproductions for far less. Still, he was impressed with the quality of their works and suggested they work with artists to create new, original art. It was much more interesting than printing reproductions and would have a greater market. The Grossmans received another sign of encouragement: the unexpected discovery of Bavarian limestones, used in lithography, in the garden pathway at their cottage. A neighbor sold them a used lithography press for $15, and a local printer provided them with instructions. Grossman soon found Robert Blackburn, seen here, who would become ULAE's first master printer. Blackburn was a talented printmaker who founded his own cooperative print studio in New York in 1948. For Grossman's first projects, she was drawn to the idea of making collaborative books between artists and poets. The first was pairing Larry Rivers and poet Frank O'Hara, which evolved into a 12-page book titled Stones that took 2 years to complete. At the same time, Rivers completed individual prints. Before Stones was even published, ULAE began printing single prints. 7 years after Grossman brought the used printmaking press into her living room, ULAE's work was getting recognized. 97 of their published works were selected for the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition, American Painters as New Lithographers. Maurice helped guide ULAE's selection of artists by going to museums, galleries, and listening to other artists talk. Advice also came from artists that they worked with. Rivers recommended artists like Helen Frankenthaler, Grace Hartigan, and Marisol. Like Atelier 17, experimentation was encouraged, but the invited artist was not part of a larger workshop community. The prints were guided by Grossman, giving the output a more overall aesthetic. Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg are among the great printmakers of the 20th century, and both worked with ULAE. Most of Jasper Johns' early prints were based on his other works. While print collectors at the time questioned whether it was too reproductive, one has to keep in mind that Johns regularly returns to his motifs. He first worked at ULAE in 1960. Initially, lithography suited Johns and enabled him to create print versions of iconic depictions of flags, maps, and targets that filled his paintings. In 1967, the newly founded National Endowment for the Arts granted ULAE funds to purchase an intaglio press and to hire Don Stewart to expand their offerings in their facility. That same year, Johns expanded his repertoire to etching. In first etchings, The First Date, the artist juxtaposed hand-drawn images and photo-engraved etchings of his earlier sculptures and reliefs. Flag, which is in our collection, is from his second portfolio, seen here, in which he added more drawing over the images. Johns said that he enjoyed etching for the ability of the copper plate to store multiple layers of information. One can work in one way on a plate, later work in another way, and the print can show all these different times in one moment. He compared and stated that this was not the case, though, with lithography. And interestingly, I read that the edition size of early ULA publications was determined by sunset, since they would print only the number that could be done in one day. And lower edition numbers do not indicate better or even earlier impressions, only which sheets ended up on top of the stack the day the artist came to sign. Robert Rauschenberg worked in a variety of media, including print and performance, often juxtaposing seemingly unrelated objects drawn from everyday life. He was invited to ULAE in 1960 and had little interest in traditional printmaking. He made the now infamous statement, "The second half of the 20th century has no time to start with writing on rocks." This is a reference to lithography and how the artist makes the image on Bavarian limestone. Accident was not his earliest lithograph at ULAE and is not in our collection, but is one of his most famous and is accompanied by a humorous story. In Rauschenberg's desire to create a picture that is more like the real world, he made art out of the real world. He would often work in collage, using cast-off objects from daily life. He applied untraditional materials like leaves, notebook paper, and tools, and added painterly marks, creating compositions with little regard to symbolism or narration. He liked the unpredictability of how magazine illustrations transferred to stone also. So to create this print, he paired a reproduction of a painting by the 18th century Italian artist Giovanni Battista Tiepolo and a baseball player, sourced from a discarded printing plate from the New York Times. He inked the plates, applied them directly to the stone. Rauschenberg augmented the found imagery with painterly strokes to connect the images, reminiscent of abstract expressionism. However, while running a test print, the lithographic stone cracked under the pressure of the press. Apparently, the guilty party was a piece of cardboard that had gotten lodged under the press's roller. He worked on a second stone, composing a drawing of the debris generated by the crack. Rauschenberg could have attempted to join the stones to form a smooth surface, but he admired his friend John Cage's musical compositions that relied on improvisation and chance. So similarly, he embraced this mishap by printing the two halves of the broken stone, leaving a slashing white void, and fittingly named it Accident. Ironically, this print brought attention to the artist and ULAE as winner of the Grand Prix at an international print exhibition in Yugoslavia, which was the most prestigious international exhibition of prints of the time. Many of the works in the museum's collections published by ULAE are by painters who were working in the 1980s. Given that many of these artists had no prior experience with printmaking, the workshops sometimes had to bridge this unfamiliarity with the medium. Susan Rothenberg's approach in painting was spontaneous and expressive, at odds to the pre-planning required in printmaking. The master printers at ULAE attempted to modify printmaking tools in a way that made them respond like drawing materials familiar to her. In etching, Rothenberg might use a bamboo pen and sugar lift, which is applied by brush. But for lithographs, as seen here in Monkey in a Tree, the ULAE printers developed a way to make charcoal, a common drawing material, greasy so that it could be used on a litho stone. Even though there are litho crayons and pencils, Rothenberg experienced more resistance drawing with a litho crayon on the stone surface, then moving charcoal on paper. To achieve the same feel for the materials, they wrapped charcoal with pieces of cotton, towel, soaked in oleic acid, which made the charcoal receptive to grease. When drawing with the wrapped charcoal, it left greasy marks on the stone. And we see in Monkey in the Tree that their solution allowed Rothenberg to draw as freely as she would on paper. This is Down Dog by Elizabeth Murray. It's an unconventional approach to making a print, reminiscent of her paintings. Murray painted works that are abstract, but usually had references to objects and rooms. In the 1980s, she began to paint on a large scale, canvases irregularly shaped and layered, breaking with conventions of the flat and rectilinear picture plane. These compositions became more aggressive and dynamic as Murray began to break her canvases apart, often sectioning them into fragmented multiples of 2 to 20 pieces. Down Dog is not presented on a rectangular sheet of paper. Like her shaped, fragmented paintings, Murray pushed the boundaries of the traditional format for printing. In Down Dog, all the segments were torn into different triangular shapes and attached together with paper hinges. Where 2 or 3 plates overlapped, she did 2 or 3 pieces of paper. Down Dog is a 9-colored lithograph. She used litho crayon to build up the tonal layers to a rich density of color. The extensive crayon work demonstrates how lithography can translate direct handwork. A semi-transparent gray gives shape and substance to the shattered table. It contrasts with the dog's body, not only in how it is drawn, but also in the quality of the ink surface. Not everyone invited to ULAE was immediately responsive. In 1982, ULAE extended an invitation to Bill Jensen to work at their studio. He was receiving critical attention for his intimately sized abstract paintings. Director Bill Goldston had known Jensen since graduate school and reached out to him with the idea of a collaboration. Jensen was hesitant to work at this now celebrated print shop. He had no previous experience in printmaking, and artists like Johns and Rauschenberg from a generation earlier had created some of their most significant works there. Also, Jensen's working process was a very private one, done in solitude. 1 year later, Jensen accepted and visited the studio. It was through Goldston's suggestion that Jensen work in etching. The artist recalled later, "Only at ULAE could I have worked for 2 years on a 5x7-inch plate." The portfolio entitled Endless is made up of 11 works, sometimes using etching, aquatint, dry point, engraving, using different inks and 3 tonalities of paper. The order of the prints in the portfolio follows the sequence of creation. Typically, Jensen collected his ideas in a small notebook, rendering things he observed and imagined. The small drawings became the springboard for his prints at ULAE. The finished prints were comparable in size to his sketches. His imagery consisted of organic shapes that are mysterious, yet suggest nature, primordial forms, and the cosmos. The prints seem to document Jensen's journey through experimenting with the new medium, and once he felt comfortable, he wanted to learn as many intaglio processes as possible. His working practice was meticulous and entailed repeatedly adding lines and scraping away other areas. The plate retained the history of this. It was a lengthy progression going from trial proof to final state, almost endless. He aptly named the portfolio Endless. Etching became entwined with the development of his imagery in his drawings and painting. In working with different printers, Jensen explained, each printer had their own unique way of working. They would introduce me to techniques that they thought were important to my image. They would get me into trouble to understand it and use it in my work. The next week I would push their knowledge, get them in trouble. Through this give and take, we developed many interesting techniques. Light seen here was printed in 7 colors. He didn't want to use plate tone nor hand coloring on his etchings. Everything had to be in the copper, giving his prints a deep, rich color. Terry Winters began making prints at ULAE in 1982 and has been a consummate printmaker ever since, collaborating with them on about 30 editions. In Primer, we see Winters enjoying the unique character of drawing in lithography, its greasy and powdery qualities, to create these ambiguous biomorphic forms, recalling structures viewed under a microscope. The background is filled with thin blue horizontal lines, as if Winters had sketched on ruled paper. Even though the subject reads like it is in black and white, still to achieve this, the print is made up of 6 colors. Problem-solving skills between the artist and the master printer are important in making artistic concepts a reality, often using methods that are untested. Kiki Smith's works largely as a sculptor and brings this sensibility to her two-dimensional work. This untitled lithograph is often referred to as the hair print. As a sculptor, Smith wanted to depict an unfolded head. How can the head be seen in the round in a flat image? This was an idea that would preoccupy her for several years. Smith made a plaster mold of her head and neck. However, plaster would not hold the printing ink. Instead, a vulcanized rubber cast was made from it, inked and then impressed on the lithographic plate. Profiles of Smith's face are visible in the 3 corners of the resulting image, all but the lower left corner. Their coarse texture differs from that of the tangle of hair. To create the massive lines, Smith not only printed photocopied transfers of her own hair, but inked and printed from a wig and corn silk. In addition to accessing the vast experience of master printers, often the printmaking workshops had equipment that was generally unavailable to artists. In this case, printmaking presses that could handle greater scale. In the beginning, the prints were relatively small. In the case of works seen here by Kiki Smith, Jane Hammond, and Carol Dunham, the dimensions rivaled the size of paintings. Jane Hammond's work in the center is 78 by 51 inches. The final pioneering printmaking press we'll look at is Tamarind Lithography Workshop, known as Tamarind Institute. Its founder, June Wayne, was an artist struggling to find skilled printers in the US that she could work with like she could in Europe. Wayne saw lithography in a state of decline, especially in the business of lithographic reproductions. Wayne didn't see much innovation. Works began to look alike. Lithography wasn't taught in printmaking departments at colleges and universities. They favored intaglio techniques. Despite all this, she felt that there would be public interest. As its name suggests, Tamarind Lithography Workshop devoted itself to lithography, but was formed with a different premise. Wayne submitted a proposal to the Ford Foundation that would bring new life to lithography in multiple ways. The print workshop first opened on 1112 Tamarind Avenue in Los Angeles in 1960, receiving a series of grants from the Ford Foundation. Wayne founded the Tamarind Lithography Workshop with Clinton Adams and Garo Antresian. The final grant was in 1970, the year that it morphed into Tamarind Institute at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque as an educational center. Interestingly, Tamarind invited Stanley Hayter in the early 1960s, but the artist found he couldn't concentrate in the more relaxed atmosphere. Tamarind offered residencies for artists working in diverse styles. They would work closely and collaborate with a master printer. They were encouraged to experiment and extend the expressive potential of the medium. Tamarind was researching lithographic techniques and materials. Their 1971 publication, entitled The Tamarind Book of Lithography, Art and Techniques, was the leading technical reference book for years. Tamarind developed an apprentice training program to create a pool of master printers. This is probably its greatest enduring legacy. All this was intended to stimulate new markets for lithographs and restore the prestige of the medium with the creation of extraordinary prints. When Tamarind relocated to Albuquerque in 1970, the city boasted a diverse artistic community. Indigenous painter Fritz Scholder became the first artist Tamarind invited from New Mexico. His prior experience with lithography had been dismal when he was a student at Sacramento State College. However, this evolved into a 14-year relationship yielding over 90 edition prints. Scholder created Anpao Buffalo and Anpao Death as part of a suite of prints that also included an owl and a bat. They were all set starkly against a black background. The artist brushed on liquid tuche to give the prints textured tonal washes. The 4 prints were used in the book On Pow, An American Indian Odyssey, written by Jamaki Highwater, which received a Newbery Honor Award. Shoulder didn't create the images as literal illustrations to the story, he described them as mysterious and magical subjects. Honoring the country's 200th anniversary, Lorillard Company commissioned Shoulder and 11 other prominent American artists to create a work that answered the question, what does freedom mean to you? Shoulder's seated indigenous subject is set off by a flat yellow ochre background. The U.S. flag draped over his lap adds irony. The source of the composition is likely studio photographer Charles Milton Bell's portrait of Chief Medicine. Shoulder clothed his figure in bicentennial Indian in traditional dress, including the same hair bow, conch shells, ermine, and eagle feather fan. The oddity is the European-style upholstered chair. The photograph was part of Bell's documentation of the 1880 Crow Peace delegation that came to Washington, D.C. The diplomatic meeting led to the surrendering of tribal land to the U.S. government. Hollis Sigler created 5 prints at Tamarin during visits in 1990 and later in 1996. In contrast to Shoulder's references to history, Hollis Sigler's work is more autobiographical. In 1985, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Initially, she addressed her illness indirectly in her art by simply exploring the emotional and psychological impact. After her cancer had metastasized into her bones in 1991, that she made her illness the subject of her art, desiring to create something more positive. Sigler drew domestic interiors, spaces traditionally associated with women. The lady, a personification of the artist, is mentioned in many of her narratives. The lady is often absent, though. It is as if she has just left the scene, as in taking stock of her situation. But her presence is still felt. Instead, household furniture and clothing become the protagonists. Sigler used vibrant colors and described objects with spontaneous, delicate lines. Both of these examples are from 1996 and are 5-color lithographs. We will end with Leslie Dill's lithograph entitled Exhilaration is Within. She collaborated on 19 prints with Tamarin master printers. This is an example of a print that extends our concept of a traditional print, usually seen printed on a full sheet. It is beautifully executed as Dill accentuates muscle tone and gives the remarkable illusion of volume sitting in a space, especially noticeable in the contours of the feet that are shown foreshortened. A template for the paper cutout was made for consistency. The dark gray paper is crumpled, giving it an interesting texture like wrinkled skin. The cutout is sewn on and attached with a delicate threads that hang down. Many of her other paperworks involve stitching. Dill is known for making sculptures, drawings, and prints that integrate the poems of Emily Dickinson into body fragments of clothing. In this case, it's the poem Exhilaration is Within. She rarely presents a literal illustration of the poem, but gives tangible form to the language of emotion, feeling, and sound. Words are printed in various sizes and with different concentrations of ink, emphasizing certain words, likened to how they might sound. Soul is a word that figures largely in Dickinson's poetry and stands out prominently in the figure. So thank you for tuning in today. Please join me on November 8th when we will continue this series on printmaking workshops. We will look more closely at 2 influential presses, Tamarin Institute that we looked at today, and Crown Point Press, which revitalized intaglio processes. We will look at Tamarin's master printer program in lithography and its legacy seen in its graduates who went on to open their own print studios, such as Ken Tyler's Gemini GL and Tyler Graphics, and Jack Lemon of Landfall Press.